raise a lot of money in small money this cycle.
Michael Schur, thank you very much.
Thanks so
Time
much.
Magazine. And now live coverage of the House. They will be voting on the debt ceiling issue sometime this afternoon between 4 and 5. Look for our coverage on C-SPAN.
As Speaker Pro Tempore on this day, signed, John Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 17, 2012, the Chair will now recognize members from a list submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member other than the majority and minority leaders and the minority whip limited to 5 minutes each. But in no event shall the debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We begin the new year on the same sour note with which we concluded 2011, an appalling year full of fabricated crises that didn't need to happen, but which produced real-life consequences, the debt ceiling debacle being but one example. The Republican nomination of a presidential candidate is showing the dark side of this new era of super PACs and what happens when a party is captive to ideological extremists. Even if you're not a Republican, it's a sad indictment. We need 2 constructive, effective, responsible political parties, or at least as close as we can come. It's past time to respond to things that Americans need and support. It really doesn't need to be this hard. I would suggest that one test going forward would be dealing with issues that could be supported by both the Tea Party and the Occupy Wall Street protesters. Both movements responses to a shared concern that Americans are being shortchanged, that America is on a path that is not sustainable, and a political process that is unable to respond to their needs. Both movements are understandable and have valid concerns. The political process is too often stacked against people trying to make changes in how we do business. The degree of overlap between the 2 narratives is very encouraging, and I think is healthy that both found political expression. The question is the extent to which people who identify with these movements can identify with each other and with practical, achievable responses. I think they can. This year, I hope that both sides of the aisle here in Congress will think about what those shared objectives might be. Agricultural reform ought to be at the very top of the list. We have a system that the right and the left can agree shortchanges most farmers and ranchers and is far too expensive. It is tilted towards large agribusiness, not to smaller operations, a quintessential family farm. We know we can do better to help more people while we save taxpayer money, improve the environment, and enhance the health of our children dealing with school nutrition. Another major area of agreement deals with American leadership in helping the 2 billion poor people around the world who do not have access to safe drinking water or adequate sanitation, or tragically to both. The United States has the potential to dramatically enhance the effectiveness of the work we are already doing and the money we are already spending. I am pleased we have bipartisan legislation with my friend Ted Poe from Texas as the lead Republican to enhance these international water and sanitation efforts. For years, I've been working to enhance the capacity of our health care system to help people when they are most vulnerable. This has commonly been referred to as end of life, but it is not just that. It is much more. It is any time people are in difficult medical conditions when they may lose control over what happens to them. We need to make sure that people understand their choices, are able to articulate what they and their family want, and that their health care wishes, whatever they may be, are respected. This bipartisan concept got caught up in the madness of the 2009 Political Lie of the Year death panels, but it's now time to revisit it. It's overwhelmingly supported by the American people, including the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, costs nothing and will help enhance the well-being of our families. There's a golden opportunity to come together around a collective vision of rebuilding and renewing America. This is happening at the state and local level as people are uniting around their vision and putting up money to achieve it. This is the fastest way to revitalize the economy and protect our quality of life, and the federal government should be playing. While I strongly support efforts to correct the distorting, in some ways corruption of the political process by avalanches of secret money that is now savaging Republican candidates for the presidential nomination, there's another corrupting process that is taking place for which there are no constitutional barriers to remediate: the legislative redistricting process. In most states, it's a scandal where politicians pick the voters rather than voters being able to pick the politician. We all ought to identify with the reform efforts that are emerging in this area. These are 5 simple steps that don't cost money, and certainly in the long run will save money while they enhance the integrity of the system. They can strengthen the economy while revitalizing the political process and addressing the frustrations of both the Wall Street and the Tea Party.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's great to be back down on the floor, back to be in Washington, D.C. to continue what I spent most of my time last year was addressing the high-level nuclear waste issues in this country. So today we go to this great state of Tennessee and identify a location where there is presently high-level nuclear waste stored, and compare that to the site that was picked that is in federal law right now, which is a high-level nuclear waste depository scheduled to occur in Yucca Mountain. So here we have, first of all, this is Sequoia in Tennessee. There's over 1,094 MTUs of spent nuclear fuel on site. At Yucca Mountain, which is in the desert in Nevada, there's currently no nuclear waste on site. At Sequoia, the waste is stored above the ground in pools and dry cast. If we were to put it in Yucca Mountain where it's supposed to go, the waste would be stored 1,000 feet underground, underneath, in essence, a mountain. At Sequoia, the waste is 25 feet from the groundwater, from the table. At Yucca Mountain, it would be 1,000 feet above the water table. And Yucca Mountain is 100 miles from the Colorado River. Sequoia is 14 miles from the city of Chattanooga and 14 miles from Chickamauga Lake. So why do I highlight these issues? Because of what happened in Japan with Fukushima Daiichi and the high-level nuclear waste. A lot of the nuclear exposure was because pools had dried up, the nuclear waste heated up, and then you had almost a worldwide catastrophe right next to the ocean. If we were doing what was public policy in federal law and collecting our high-level nuclear waste and taking it to a desert underneath a mountain, that would be a much more secure location than around our major municipalities, our streams, and our groundwater locations. But no, because of this administration and some political promises made in the last election cycle, they have defunded and pulled off the table Yucca Mountain from consideration. In 1982, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act made the federal government responsible for collecting waste. Since that time, $9 billion was spent on 20 years studying for a suitable location. That study ended in Yucca Mountain. In 1987, Congress named Yucca Mountain the sole candidate site for a permanent repository. And then in '94, DOE published scientific results demonstrating Yucca is capable of protecting public health and safety. In '98, the statutory deadline for DOE to commence disposal of spent nuclear fuel, so we pay these nuclear utilities money to hold their own waste that we should be collecting based upon federal law. In 2002, we voted here, and the President and Congress approved Yucca as the site repository. DOE issued a license application in 2008, and then in 2009, President Obama announced plans to terminate Yucca Mountain after $15 billion spent in studying this site. And I'll close with this. Would you rather have nuclear waste 14 miles from a major metropolitan area next to a lake, or would you rather have high-level nuclear waste hundreds of miles from the largest city, 100 miles from a river, underneath a mountain in the desert? Public policy, good public policy demands that we move forward on Yucca Mountain, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to congratulate the University of Alabama Crimson Tide for being the 2011 BCS champions. Roll Tide. The state of Alabama is still #1 in college football. For the past 3 consecutive years, a team from the state of Alabama has won the national championship trophy. The University of Alabama has been the national champs twice in the last 3 years. The championship game between Alabama and LSU represents college football at its finest. Both schools have a proud and very rich tradition in football history, and the LSU Tigers should be commended for an outstanding season. While both teams deserve recognition, in the end, Alabama beat LSU with a final score of 21-0. I want to congratulate the coaches, staff, team, and the entire university family and fans for an amazing season. It was your hard work, persistence, leadership, and commitment all season long that made this decisive victory become a reality. The University of Alabama has had a long-standing tradition of excellence in collegiate football. This year's victory represented the 14th national championship title for the University of Alabama. Since being founded in 1892, the Crimson Tide football program has achieved 813 victories in the NCAA Division I and 26 conference championships. The Crimson Tide also sets an NCAA record with 58 postseason bowl appearances. The Tide leads the SEC West Division with seven division titles and 7 appearances in the SEC championship games. This entire team deserves recognition and honor, and I want to especially acknowledge Trent Richardson, who is a Heisman Trophy finalist and winner of this year's nation's most outstanding running back. I'd also like to acknowledge Barrett Jones, who was the 2011 Outland Trophy winner for the nation's best interior lineman in college football. This championship team also includes 6 players who were selected for the 2011 Associated Press All-American team: Mark Barron, Dante Hightower, Barrett Jones, Trent Richardson, Courtney Upshaw, and Dre Kirkpatrick. This year's team was truly a force to be reckoned with. This win not only represents a victory for the University of Alabama football team, but it also is a unifying victory for the state of Alabama, who suffered so much during the devastation of the April tornadoes. This victory shows the resilient spirit of Alabamians and reflects our hope for a better future. I speak on behalf of the constituents of the 7th Congressional District, the great state of Alabama, and this nation as I express how proud we are of the players, coaches, and athletic staff of the University of Alabama for making this victory possible and helping our communities heal. I also want to thank Representative Cassidy of Louisiana for being such a good sport and looking so dapper today in his brand new Crimson Tide tie and attire. What an addition to your wardrobe. I urge my colleagues to please join me in celebrating the achievements of the University of Alabama Crimson Tide and its outstanding athletes on their 2011 BCS championship victory. Roll Tide.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the 112th Congress was sworn in on January 5, 2011, I, along with many of my fellow Republicans, voted to change the status quo. Instead of escalating spending, we have made and pushed for significant spending cuts. Instead of forcing a $1 trillion government takeover of health care on the American people, we voted to repeal it in the House. And instead of imposing costly and burdensome regulations on an already struggling business economy, we passed legislation to reverse overly burdensome regulations so businesses can get back to hiring again. These are the vows we made to our constituents when we took office a year ago. And despite hitting numerous snags in the do-nothing Senate and with leadership lacking in the White House, we delivered on the promises. In the past year, the House has passed 27 job-creating measures as part of our plan for American job creators. We've remained committed to removing the onerous taxes and regulations that are crippling small businesses and our families, and are the cause for so much distrust of Washington. We've begun an honest conversation about which programs are in alignment with our constitutional principles and which programs are wasteful and inefficient. We have the responsibility to make the federal government live within its means, just like hardworking families across the country. This means we have cut spending, stop raising taxes, and eliminate wasteful spending from our outdated, overreaching government programs. When we took office last January, we vowed to reduce discretionary spending to 2008 levels, and we delivered. The House passed a bill to reduce spending by $5.8 trillion over the next 10 years. We also voted to cut over 100 programs across government and save billions of dollars in the process. In May, the House also overwhelmingly voted against giving President Obama a blank check to increase the debt limit without spending reductions or reforms. We've relentlessly fought for policies that will encourage job creation and free our families from the burdensome economic problems of government regulation. We acted to undo duplicative permitting requirements for farmers by passing the Reduced Regulatory Burdens Act. We pushed back against the President's attempts to implement a cap-and-trade policy, an energy reduction policy, really, through the regulatory process by passing the Energy Tax Prevention Act. As we confronted the EPA's costly and burdensome agenda by passing 3 regulatory reform bills that safeguard our environment while keeping the Americans at work. On November 16th, we defeated the 3% withholding rule by passing H.R. 674. This misguided tax rule would have required government agencies at all levels to withhold 3% of their payments to businesses for goods and services. Any small business that contracts with the government would have their profit margins wiped out if such a rule were allowed to take effect. We passed the REINS Act to bring accountability to the executive branch by requiring that government bureaucrats receive permission from Congress, the elected representatives of the people, before the implementation of any major regulation. Just 2 weeks after beginning our work in Congress, the House voted to repeal the overreaching, costly, and harmful government takeover of health care that President Obama forced upon the American people. H.R. 2 was one of my first votes after being sworn in. The bill cut new spending by $1.4 trillion over 10 years and repealed the President's health care takeover, and I was proud to vote to repeal this job-killing law, which will do nothing to bring stability and certainty to American families. Throughout the first session of the 112th Congress, House Republicans have remained committed to changing the way the government does business. We've delivered on our promises to pass legislation that reins in spending and encourages job creation. Going forward, I'm hopeful that our friends in the Senate and the leadership in the White House will finally be ready to join us in passing legislation that the American people want and not let dozens of job-producing bills sit idle in the Senate. This year, I look forward to working with my colleagues in the House as we look beyond the next election and focus on improving people's lives and creating a brighter economic future with the freedom God really intended for all of us. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, for 5 minutes.
PIPA, Protect Internet Privacy, Protect Intellectual Property Act. SOPA, Stop Online Piracy Act. Now, who could be against bills like that to prevent the theft, of intellectual property or online piracy, to prevent online piracy. Clever names, great. Content, not so much. Now, the worst organized, government-sanctioned theft of international property in the world goes on day in, day out in communist China. And this government has done precious little to rein that in. We run a huge trade deficit with China. We're buying their goods. They're dependent upon our purchasing of their goods, and yet we allow them to get away with that. This bill does nothing to deal with the organized theft in communist China, which is the greatest problem that confronts us in the theft of intellectual property. Now, concealed behind these really benign names and embedded in the text is something that's kind of like what we call malware. Now, we all know what malware can do to our computers. We've seen it, the black screen of death. Well, this is a little bigger than malware that gets on your computer, steals your data, or crashes your computer. It could crash the entire Internet and the productivity in the Internet. Now, eventually, this legislation could threaten the existence of an entire domain because of one blog entry, one user link, the whole domain be taken down. Wow, that's pretty incredible. Imagine how some of these user content sites are going to have to try and police things. Well, they can always err on the side of censorship because there's broad provisions in this bill to allow you, in good faith, to censor something because you thought maybe it was a problem. So they could start censoring rather dramatically. The legislation also includes very broad language for so-called anti-circumvention. That is, any site that provides information that could, maybe, possibly, help users get around censorship would be a target. Well, that's kind of an interesting contradiction for the government of the United States, because actually we promote, through the State Department, software that helps democratic activists in communist China, which I already mentioned, in Iran, and other vicious dictatorships around the world, to get around their government's online censorship. We're now going to enshrine principles that would allow this sort of censorship, sort of mimicking some of the actions of the Iranian and the communist Chinese, I guess, in regards to the Internet here. Of course, we're going to allow private companies to impose this censorship instead of the government imposing this censorship, but they would have government enforcement behind their actions, the private right of actions that would be allowed in this bill. This is pretty extraordinary legislation, very poorly drafted. If you wanted to, if you didn't care about the Internet and it didn't exist, and you wanted to put in the toughest possible protections of theoretically for privacy, for piracy and intellectual property, maybe you'd write something like this. But there's a better way to go than to kill the Internet at the same time as you're trying to get at these few bad actors that are out there, let alone the state bad actors like China. I'd love to see a bill drafted to take on the Chinese on their multi-billion-dollar annual theft of intellectual property from the United States of America. Oh, we can't take on China. No, they're too big. So instead, we'll go after small, creative people who could tread across this line unknowingly, who are participating, in a much larger site. They have their blog as part of that site, or they have their post as part of that site. The whole site could be taken down. This legislation, I'm pleased to say that it seems like the White House has woken up to the dangers here. The fact that we are essentially creating the Patriot Act national security letter provisions for private companies to censor the Internet. We cannot let that happen. We must stop this legislation. We also need to take on meaningfully piracy and the theft of intellectual property.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. During the Christmas break, I wrote a letter to President Obama expressing outrage over the fact that Afghan President Karzai again stubbed our country and our men and women in uniform by signing an oil contract with China. How much more do the American people have to sacrifice with their young men and women? How many more young men and women have to walk the countryside of Afghanistan and have a leg blown off or an arm or killed so that Mr. Karzai can continue to say to Uncle Sam, we don't need you, but you got to stay here so I can cut all these deals with these foreign countries. December the 8th of 2010, Washington Post article, while meeting with General Petraeus and former Ambassador Eikenberry, President Karzai said, I have three main enemies, the Taliban, the United States, and the international community. Karzai further stated, if I had to choose sides today, I'd choose the Taliban. Yes, young men and women in uniform, thank you for what you're doing, but it's time to bring you home. November 14, 2010, in an interview with the Washington Post, Karzai said that he wanted American troops off the roads and out of Afghan homes, and that the long-term presence of so many foreign soldiers would only worsen the war. Very seldom do I say, thank you, Mr. Karzai, you're exactly right. March 12, 2011, New York Times, and I quote, I request that NATO and American soldiers should start these operations on our soil, he said. This war is not on our soil. If this war is against terror, then this war is not here. Terror is not here. Mr. Karzai, President of Afghanistan. October 2011, during a television interview, President Karzai stated, and I quote, if ever there is a war between Pakistan and America, Afghanistan will side with the Pakistanis. Why are we still there spending $10 billion a month and saying to the American people, we're going to cut your school programs, we're going to cut your bridge programs, we're going to cut your road programs. American people, we don't have the money, but somehow we have $10 billion a month to send to Mr. Karzai. This little boy beside me is named Tyler Jordan. In 2003, his father, Gunny Sergeant Philip Jordan, was killed in Iraq. I have spoken to the mom, Amanda. She lives in Connecticut. I've asked her about Tyler. I've had this picture since 2003. She says he still misses his daddy. He will always miss his father. Bin Laden is dead. Al-Qaeda has been dispersed all over the world. I hope the American people will call their members of Congress in both parties and say, get our troops out of Afghanistan. Do not wait till 2014, 2015. I don't know how many more will have to die for a corrupt leader named Karzai. We have won. Bin Laden is dead. We have won. Declare victory and bring them home. God continue to bless our men and women in uniform, bless the families who've given a child dying for freedom in Afghanistan and Iraq. And God, please continue to bless America. We're in great need of your guidance, dear God. God bless America. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, let me just say to the prior gentleman who spoke, Mr. Jones, that I appreciate him continuing to call for the end of the war and occupation of Afghanistan and bringing our young men and women home. Because, of course, we know that this war has created undue hardship, so many deaths, and really has been the longest war, really, in our lifetime. And so thank you, Mr. Jones, for your leadership. I am the founder of the Congressional Out of Poverty Caucus, and I just have to rise today on behalf of the caucus to continue to talk about the tide of poverty that's sweeping our country. As we begin now the second session of the 112th Congress, we must do more to help the millions of Americans living in poverty, looking hard for a job, and working hard every day to move up the ladder of opportunity and earn their share of the American dream. Mr. Speaker, on January 4th, the New York Times reported that economic mobility, the ability to work hard and make your fortune from humble beginnings, which is the fundamental cornerstone of the American dream, that's getting harder and harder to achieve in America. Americans are falling behind and are increasingly cut off from their dreams of having a job and supporting their families. How in the world did this happen? The failed policies of the past administration only helped the richest among us become richer and concentrated greater wealth in the hands of a wealthy few. And today, House Republican leadership has failed to address the needs of most Americans. The only way that our economy can recover and reduce poverty is to create jobs and to expand access to the economic opportunities. We find that the lack of opportunity and economic mobility is worse at the bottom, and without a real commitment to change, it will only get worse. The Republican-led Congress has been too beholden to their extremist Tea Party base to reach the necessary compromises to move our nation forward and to begin the hard work of rebuilding and growing our economy for all Americans. Now, President Obama did stop the economy from going off a cliff, and Congress must work with the President to put our nation back on the road to recovery and growth. We continue to have unacceptably high unemployment, and we all know that the rates of unemployment and the rates of poverty in our minority communities continue to be about twice the national average. But even these painful and these shameful statistics may not completely show just how much Wall Street has focused their efforts on stripping communities of color of the little wealth that they have managed to accumulate over the last few decades. The Pew Research Center found that minority households were hit disproportionately hard by the housing and financial crisis. The Pew Center found that from 2005 to 2009, median wealth fell by 66% among Hispanic households and 53% among black households, compared to just 16% among white households. As a result of these declines, the typical African-American household now has, mind you, just $5,677 in wealth. The typical Hispanic household has $6,300 in wealth, and the typical white household has $113,000 in net worth. So the facts speak for themselves. Wall Street targeted minority homeowners and minority communities, and we must respond accordingly. It is long past time that we as a nation enact bold programs and policies that ensure that we are a nation that truly does provide equal opportunity and access to the American dream, rather than allowing, for example, minorities to be targeted for policies and programs that undermine their ability to achieve the American dream. We must begin immediately to have an up or down vote on a clean bill that extends vital emergency unemployment benefits for the 99 weeks for the millions of job seekers who continue to struggle to find a job and are no longer eligible for unemployment compensation. Mr. Speaker, the majority of Americans who are struggling to find a job now are already no longer getting unemployment benefits due to the 99-week wall. But people want to work. There are 4 people, however, looking for 1 job, and that is a fact. So we need to pass H.R. 3638, the Restore the American Dream Act, for the 99%, a package of job creation measures and policy reforms introduced by the Congressional Progressive Caucus. This bill would significantly boost employment and create jobs in the short term and improve the fiscal outlook in the long term. It's the right thing to do. Instead, this Tea Party-led Congress has wasted an entire year without any jobs bills, without extending any new help to the millions of Americans in need. We can't wait, and neither should Congress. Let's help to make sure that the poor and the unemployed Americans find good-paying jobs and make that our #1 priority. We must remove these obstacles to reignite the American dream.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kissinger, 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, when we look at what are some of the most important issues facing our country today, obviously economy comes very first. Next, we talk about energy. We talk about spending, and we talk about national security, all very important. You know, one of the nexus between economy and between national defense is energy, and our lack of energy here at home. Yesterday, the President's own Jobs Council called for an all-in approach to energy policy that includes expanded oil and gas drilling, as well as expediting energy projects like pipelines. The report stated that the Council recognizes the important safety and environmental concerns surrounding these types of projects, but now more than ever, the jobs and economic and energy security benefits of these energy projects require us to tackle the issues head-on and to expeditiously, though cautiously, move forward on projects that can support hundreds of thousands of jobs. The Keystone XL pipeline does just that. This pipeline would directly create 20,000 American jobs in manufacturing and construction and 118,000 total jobs. In addition, we would see 830,000 barrels of safe and secure oil each day from our friends to the north, which means we'll need less oil from countries we can no longer rely on and are not friendly to the interests of the United States. Caterpillar, a leading manufacturer from my home state, supports securing stable and affordable energy from a North American ally through the Keystone XL pipeline and urges approval of this pipeline. Daniel McCollan, the Global Pipeline General Manager for Caterpillar, said, "Considering the economic and energy security benefits of these vital resources, we should continue to expand America's access to safe, affordable energy to help ensure improved domestic and global energy security and stable prices for consumers. Pipelines are a critical part of our energy infrastructure, and additional pipeline capacity will help consumers and businesses throughout the United States." There's a lot of talk of the need for bipartisanship today. There's a lot of talk for the need to unite different factions of people into one common goal for our country, and I agree that when you look at this project, the Keystone Pipeline, it has bipartisan support. There were Democrats that supported this bill as well as Republicans, and something that I believe we should move forward on as a country. Manufacturers and unions and union organizations are united alike in supporting this project. Last summer, the State Department announced that this extension had passed extensive environmental reviews. But President Obama has already stalled for more than 26 days to make a decision on the Keystone XL pipeline. The fact is that somebody will benefit from oil out of Alberta, Canada. If it's not the United States, it will be China, unless we take immediate action to expand the Keystone XL pipeline, and it'll be American businesses and consumers who will suffer the consequences from our inaction. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm an Air Force pilot. I've been overseas, I've fought in these wars, and I can tell you, as much as I think we're doing the right thing, one thing we can do is to reduce our reliance on foreign oil so that when Iran threatens to close the Straits of Hormuz, it means nothing to the energy security of this country and just simply leads to what that's going to mean for them. I strongly urge President Obama to immediately support this job-creating bipartisan project. The time to act is now, and I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Kepler, for 5 minutes.
Consent to address the House for 5 minutes and to place extraneous material in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my first reaction upon reading Dr. Gordon Gee's denigrating comments about the Polish Army was to see red, blood red. As a Polish American, I failed to see the humor when the president of The Ohio State University described bureaucratic turf battles at his school with administrators, quote, shooting each other as, quote, kind of like the Polish Army. His comments revealed not only insensitivity to the suffering of the Polish people over the past 2 centuries, but a shocking lack of knowledge of history. Surely the leader of a major institution of higher learning should know better. Ohio State, after all, is home to the Center for Slavic and East European Studies. Having spent my public career trying to overcome ethnic stereotyping, I thought about how to respond. Do I hold a press conference? Do I make an official statement? The Polish-American Congress quickly demanded, received, and accepted an apology from President Guy. But I kept thinking about my beloved, dear friend, Colonel Marian Wojciechowski, a true hero of Poland and America who died last year at age 97. I've known the Wojciechowski family for almost half a century. Marian's brilliant daughter, Marianne, was my friend in high school and the valedictorian of our class at St. Ursula Academy in Toledo. Her father, Marian, had commanded a Polish Army cavalry platoon at the place where World War II started on land, September 1st, 1939. Against impossible odds, the Polish Army secured a tactical victory at the Battle of Mokra. There was nothing disorganized or chaotic about Marian's home unit, the 21st Regiment Polku Ulanów Nadwyżklankic, which eventually was awarded the Virtuti Militari, Poland's highest military honor. No, President Guy, the Polish soldiers at Mokra did not shoot at each other. In fact, they inflicted surprisingly heavy losses against the more heavily equipped Nazi invaders who lost 800 men. Eventually, the Poles' situation deteriorated as they ran low on ammunition and medicine. No Western country came to their aid. No Western country. The infantry commander considered surrendering, but the cavalry commander ordered a charge. Polish cavalry soldiers bravely drew their swords, positioned their artillery, and heroically charged German positions, even though they were hopelessly overmatched by mechanized blitzkrieg forces on the land, including 2 Panzer divisions and in the air. A fellow soldier from Marian's hometown of Połaniec thought Marian had been killed and reported the sad news to Marian's family, who held a funeral for him. But in fact, Marian had survived, had moved east with his remaining cavalry forces to fight the Red Army that attacked Poland 3 weeks later on the Russian front, September 17th. My friend Marian was grazed in the head by a Russian bullet. He then joined the underground, the resistance, for over 2 years in such dangerous work until he was arrested, brutally tortured, and sent to Auschwitz in Death Block 11, and then transferred to Gross Rosen and finally to Leitmeritz in 1945, from which he escaped. I must mention the woman who had accidentally revealed his name was beheaded by Nazi forces. Of course, Poland, which had been partitioned by adjoining empire since the 18th century for daring to write its own democratic constitution in 1791, 2 years after our own, and upon which it was modeled, was devastated by World War II. Poland lost a higher percentage of her population than any other nation, approximately 1 in 5 people. Cities such as Warsaw were razed because their people fought unrelentingly until they were subdued. Fleeing to Germany and a U.S. Army-run refugee camp, Marian met his lifelong love, Władysława Ponienska, a Polish Girl Scout and a member of the women's underground resistance. She and her family had been arrested in Warsaw and sent to the notorious Pawiak prison, and then she to Ravensbrück, where unspeakable experiments were performed on her, and all her relatives killed. They married, they had their first child, my friend, and emigrated to America in 1950 under the Displaced Persons Act. They were sponsored by Marian's cousin in Toledo. They raised their family, and he published a Polish-language newspaper, the American Echo, for more than 7 years. He also built a career in neighborhood and community development, working until age 80. Like Generals Kosciuszko and Pulaski, Colonel Marian Wojciechowski dedicated his life to the cause of liberty and community building. He was an extraordinary man. In different times, I think he might have been president of Poland. He surely should have run for office here. I'm going to send a copy of the book, 7 Paths to Freedom, edited by Miroslav Zadowska and Andrzej Zadowski, to President Guy. I hope he reads it. It's overtime to show reverence and respect for Poland's heroic struggle for liberty. Mr. Speaker, I yield back my remaining time.
The Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, President Obama asked Congress for $1.2 trillion in additional borrowing authority. And today, Congress has the opportunity to respond to the President's request. Since the President took office, the national debt has increased $4.6 trillion. The current federal debt now exceeds the U.S. gross domestic product, and our federal government is borrowing more than 30 cents of every dollar it spends. And in recent years, that has been as high as 40 cents of every dollar it spends. The President's most recent request of a $1.2 trillion increase will bring the debt limit to $16.394 trillion. Yet despite this fiscal outlook, Admiral Mullen, the recently retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has rightly called the national debt the single biggest threat to our national security. President Obama and some in Congress still refuse to make the difficult, long-term spending choices necessary to begin restoring fiscal discipline to the federal budget. The President publicly opposed a balanced budget amendment, and an idea about which Thomas Jefferson said, "I would be willing to depend on that alone for the reduction of the administration of our government." The House of Representatives, in a majority fashion, passed a balanced budget amendment late last year. Unfortunately, it did not receive a two-thirds vote here, as the Constitution requires, and I hope we can revisit that issue. And President Obama has failed to put forth a credible budget plan that reins in runaway federal entitlement spending that is the single biggest contributor toward our long-term fiscal problems. When the President releases his budget proposal for fiscal year 2013 in a few weeks, he has another opportunity to propose real spending caps and entitlement program reforms. I hope he will seize the opportunity to do so. I commend to the President's attention and to the administration's attention, for example, Chairman Ryan's budget proposals, and we would like to work in good faith with the administration and with the President to make sure that we move forward in a fiscally responsible way. But today's debate, Mr. Speaker, is about leadership and making tough choices. The governor of the state of New Jersey, my friend Chris Christie, said last year, "Leadership today in America has to be about doing the big things." When given the opportunity to lead on issues concerning levels of spending, debt, and deficits, I urge President Obama to join with us in doing the big things to make sure that we can get our fiscal house in order, a glide path back toward fiscal responsibility, toward balancing our budget over time. We need to restore that fiscal discipline in Washington, instead of choosing the fiscally perilous path of more spending, larger annual deficits, and mounting debt. The next generation will have to pay back this debt. It is a tremendous burden on young people, and it will sap our strength in the continuing competition of the United States with the nations around the world, including, for example, China and India. Mr. Speaker, I will oppose the President's request for an additional $1.2 trillion in spending. I hope that we can work together with the administration on this fundamental issue, the issue that confronts the nation of fiscal responsibility, and may the United States be restored to fiscal responsibility so that future generations might succeed, as generations have succeeded generation in and generation out, the great promise of the American nation. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Woolsey, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, our nation is now in the 124th consecutive month of war. And while those of us privileged to serve in this body enjoyed time back home with our families for the holidays, there was no such holiday break for our service members who are serving in harm's way. Thousands of American families had a permanently empty seat around their table this holiday season because a son or daughter or mother or father was killed in one of these senseless wars that we've been fighting. I would note, as a bit of an aside, Mr. Speaker, how ironic it is that 2 days ago we celebrated a federal holiday named for a man who was a proud and principled pacifist, who believed in the moral power of nonviolent resistance. Martin Luther King once said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual doom." Mr. Speaker, it's time we paid more than lip service to his dream. It's time we started living it. It's time also that we paid more than lip service to our veterans who are returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan. These men and women who have courageously sacrificed so much for us are coming home to an economy that seems to have no place for them. Yes, we're in the grips of a devastating job crisis that's affecting just about every community and every group in the United States. But veterans of the Afghanistan and Iraq wars are feeling the squeeze disproportionately. Even as the job numbers have picked up some for the rest of the economy, because it has rallied slightly, veterans are slipping further behind. Overall unemployment dropped to 8.5% in December for our country, but for veterans who've served since September 2001, the jobless rate is a staggering 13.1%. Is this what we call a hero's welcome? Is this how our nation shows its gratitude? Closing this gap must be at the top of our 2012 calendar. There has been some progress. For example, in November, Congress passed and the President signed the Vow to Hire Heroes Act, which provides tax credits to employers who hire veterans. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to do much, much more, because unless we take bold action, this problem is going to get much worse before it gets any better, as the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq and hopefully the war in Afghanistan winds down and even more returning troops flood the jobs market. We know what to do. There's no question. We need more job training. We need more technical assistance so that these skilled young people can find the work they need. We need more career counseling and job fairs. We need to increase our investment in veterans' housing initiatives. How about helping veterans become entrepreneurs by starting their own businesses? And basically, we need more jobs in this country. We must not pinch pennies on veterans. We must not pinch pennies on their health care, and we must make sure that wounded veterans aren't victimized by job discrimination. So let's get creative here. Let's put our money where our mouth is. If we can spend billions of dollars every month on wars, then certainly we can spend a fraction of that to help the Americans who fought those wars. When they come home, they can have a seamless transition back to civilian life. These wars have already taken too much from all of us, from our country. We can't let them also destroy the job prospects and the successful futures of the people who serve so bravely on the front lines. It's time to bring our troops home and at the same time providing them with the jobs they need to support their families. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the United States Constitution is the law of the land. It must be followed in the spirit and in the letter of the law. Article 2 and Section 2 gives the executive authority to appoint certain public ministers with advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. When the Senate is in recess, the executive can make temporary appointments until the end of that legislative session. See, the Constitution envisions cooperation by the executive with the Senate over naming persons to offices that rule over the people of America. Both the executive and the Senate must agree prior to an official appointment. The Senate, within their legal prerogative, has been blocking 3 NLRB appointments and the appointment of the head of the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. However, ignoring the Senate, the executive appointed these people anyway. He declared the Senate was in recess when he made such appointments. But was it? Well, constitutional experts disagree. The Senate was in a pro forma session. One reason they were in pro forma session was to prevent recess appointments by the executive branch. During pro forma sessions, the Senate can do business and meet another constitutional requirement to not be in recess without permission of the House of Representatives. More from the Constitution. Article 1, Section 5 says no chamber, the House or the Senate, can recess for more than 3 days without the approval of the other chamber. The House did not and even could not agree to a recess of the Senate because the Senate was in session, not in a recess. The executive's claim that the Senate was in a recess is flawed because the House did not consent to any Senate recess. Thus, the Senate legally had to still be in session until the House agreed to a recess under our Constitution. Furthermore, Congress determines when it's in recess, not the executive branch. There is more evidence the Senate was in session. The executive says the pro forma session was not a real session but a recess, so thus the recess appointments. However, during this pro forma session, the Senate passed legislation. The controversial payroll tax extension law became law signed by the executive. If the Senate was in recess, as the executive claims, then it seems the payroll extension law is null and void. Why? Because Congress cannot pass legislation unless it's actually in session. However, the opposite is true. Since the payroll tax law was passed during this pro forma session and the appointments were made during this pro forma session, the appointments are null and void. They violate the letter and spirit of the Constitution. They were made without confirmation of the Senate. These were not recess appointments because the Senate was in session. The executive cannot have it both ways. The executive cannot use linguistic gimmicks to redefine the words recess and session to his own liking, just so he can have it his way. The letter and spirit of the Constitution have been bruised and violated by his actions. The Constitution must be followed whether one agrees with what it says or not. Even if the executive wins his argument, which is legally and logically flawed, he has ignored the framework of the Constitution, which is built on executive cooperation with Congress. The executive went his own way, and that's just the way it is. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On yesterday, January 17, Muhammad Ali became 70 years old. So I rise to salute the champ and to wish him a happy birthday. Ali has taken a lot of hard licks during his lifetime, but has always gotten up and has always maintained his dignity. Ali lived in and spent a great deal of time in Chicago. He attended events, went to meetings, and was part of community life. Therefore, I got to know him quite well. A few years ago, after he had become ill with Parkinson's syndrome, I sat next to Ali at a community banquet, and he was having difficulty holding on to his food and eating. The person on the other side of him was trying to help. Ali was becoming more and more irritated, and finally, in a polite but firm manner, said, "Thanks, but please leave me alone. I can do this," and I did. And I think that's characteristic of his life. Born Cassius Clay, Ali converted to Islam, became a Muslim, and changed his name. Ali took hits from individuals and fans who disagreed with his position. Initially categorized as not qualified to serve in the military because of poor performance on a selective service exam, Ali is then reclassified, but in April of 1967, he refused induction into the Army. He is tagged a draft dodger and stripped of his championship and barred from boxing. He is ultimately permitted to return. As he worked his way towards a title shot at Sonny Liston, there are rumors that the fight might be canceled because of his emerging relationship with Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. However, the fight does take place. Cassius Clay wins, and a month later, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad gives Clay a new name, Muhammad Ali. Ernie Terrell, a friend of mine who graduated from high school with my wife, refused to, and was a heavyweight champion, refused to address Ali by his new name, and Ali whipped him soundly and taunted him by asking continuously, "What's my name? What's my name?" Muhammad Ali is known as the greatest to most people for his electrifying style in the boxing ring, but others might call him the greatest for his continued humanitarian efforts outside the world of boxing. Since his retirement in 1981, he has gone on to do great things to help out the less fortunate and disenfranchised people throughout the world. In 1991, he traveled to Iraq during the Gulf War and met with Saddam Hussein in an effort to negotiate the release of American hostages. On January 8, 2005, Muhammad Ali was presented with the Presidential Citizens Medal by President George W. Bush. He has received the Spirit of America Award, calling him the most recognized American in the world. He has also been to Afghanistan as the UN Messenger of Peace. One of his most recent accomplishments has been the creation of the $60 million nonprofit Muhammad Ali Center, opened in downtown Louisville. This center was opened to reflect Mr. Ali's core values of peace, social responsibility, respect, and personal growth. These are the values that have made Muhammad Ali the great man he is today, and it's those values that should not be forgotten. Instead, they should be passed down to future generations. And so I say, happy birthday, Mr. Champ, and thanks for what you have meant and continue to mean to millions of people throughout the world. And I yield back.